The Abraham sacrifice of Isaac story. Had we had younger children here, I was going to start out with Abraham and Sarah naming their newborn child Isaac, and Sarah laughing. Show that picture of Sarah laughing. This idea of the laughter that came across this old woman, this being told here, overhearing here, that she, a 90-year-old, would have a child. Her joy was so great that she decided to name him Isaac, laughter. And then the chapter turns and we get to this next passage about what happens next. I think about these stories and how they were first told, how the oral tradition worked. That people would hear them in their worship experience, and take those stories and tell them to someone else, and keep passing them along. I think of like shepherds gathered around a fire at the end of the day, end of shepherding. They gather around there, they got their boys, they're teaching how to shepherd both sides. And one of those crusty old shepherds tells a joke. A few of them laugh. And another one tells some history lesson, and the men nod and the boys half listen. And one of them looks up at Mount Moriah and remembers that story that the priest told. It goes something like this. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham said, "Here, be cautious when you're choosing your bedtime stories. Don't pick this one. Don't pick it if you're on a camping trip. You'll be getting your wood by yourself." Of course, I don't have to tell you about that. I don't have to tell you to be cautious about which stories to read. None of us want to read a story like this. None of us want to hear a story like this. It's one we'd rather skip. The other day I just read the story to myself before rubbing suntan lotion on my children. I thought, how could Abraham do it? How could he obey God? There's nothing in me that can imagine Abraham's obedience. If any man or woman today relived this story, we would lock them up in a psychiatric ward and leave them. As we should. We've come to believe that God would never ask this of anyone. And I'm sure we're right. In fact, one of the early meanings, understandings of what this story was about was to tell the Israelites, you're different than your neighbors. The neighbors were instructed or believed that their God told them to sacrifice their children. So this was a teaching to say we're not like that. God doesn't demand this of us. God doesn't want this from us. We're going to be the kind of people who never harm our children. That was an early understanding of why such a story would be told. So I want you to know, before we get too far into it, that I guess at the risk of protecting the God who doesn't need me to protect him, that we don't have to fear the God we know in Jesus Christ would ask this of us. That's not going to be the request made of you or me. That won't be our test. I believe that to be a message of the story, that this is not how our God is. But I don't believe that to be the message of the story. I don't think that's all those shepherds, when they talked about it, would have heard. It wasn't just to say, we're not to sacrifice our children. Those shepherds would have those shepherds would have also taken in this idea that we have a God who tests. That we have a God who calls us to trust. And that we have a God who provides. Alright, so we have a heavy topic on a hot summer day. Let me go ahead and confess that I like theology. I like God talk that speaks of God providing, God's graciousness. And I'm pretty good with celebrating examples of faith and obedience. I think that's important. But I'm not real big on this idea that God tests us. There's something in me that just resists this notion of the test. I read the beginning of the opening of the book of Job, and I think, why should he be put through this? Why would God allow Job to be tested in this manner? What has he done to deserve this? That's not fair. I think if that's the way God is, I'm not sure I want part of that God. I don't think about the fact that every Sunday I pray, you pray, Lord, lead us not into temptation. A very definite sign that we believe that God is sort of the primary actor here, whether we're led into temptation or not. It's not, Lord, prevent us from ever being tempted. It's not, Lord, remove all temptations. It's, Lord, lead us not into temptation. We're giving God the responsibility in this thing to test us or not. Which is what's going on with Abraham. In this testing of Abraham, God is the primary actor. After these things, it opens, God tested Abraham. That's how the story begins. God tested Abraham. There's a great Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who suggested that God wanted to know something about Abraham. That's the point of the test, which is really the point of all tests, really, to know what we know, to show what we know. A friend of mine had a teacher when he was in school, and the teacher would hand out exams, and when the teacher handed out exams, said, "This is your opportunity to celebrate what you've learned." God, it seems, wants to know what Abraham's learned. He wants to see what is going on with Abraham. But you and I, or at least I, have this impulse to defend Abraham. Why do you need this test, God? Didn't you call him out of his home country, away from his family? And he says, "Yes, I'll go," and he goes. Didn't you announce that if he follows you, if you become his God and go the places he tells you, that he should be circumcised, and all men should be, and he accepted that? Didn't he, at nearly 100 years of age, accept this idea that he would have a son, an infant? Went with your idea there. Why, Lord, this test? Is it really necessary? In my life, I've been mostly on the receiving end of opportunities to show what I've learned. I've usually been the one who's been given the tests. Not always have those been causes for celebration. But there was an occasion, a semester, when I was on the giving end of the test. I was the one designing the test. I was the one handing them out. I was the one grading those tests. And what I learned in that experience is it's not just the people taking the test who have anxiety about them. It's also the people who are putting them together. Did I cover this well enough that she'll be able to respond? Was I clear in what I said? Am I clear in how I'm writing this question? Am I giving him the opportunity to celebrate what he knows? There's a judgment on the test giver as well as on the test taker. According to the story, God set up this test to know something about Abraham and to give Abraham reason to celebrate. And it turns out that the test taker, Abraham, knew enough about the test giver to ace the exam. Abraham assured Isaac, God himself will provide a lamb for the burnt offering, my son. He never said how God would do it. That would be more than he knew. Would it be Isaac? Would it be another? Abraham never said because he didn't know. He may have imagined that there would be another sacrifice. He told those young men with him, stay here, we will go to worship, and then we will come back to you. As the moment drew near, his faith did not waver. He still did not know how God provided, but seems sure that God would. How else could you hold a knife to your son's throat? There's no other way to do that. It was in that moment, with knife to the throat, that the angel announces to Abraham, don't do it. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Surely, given all the prior evidence, God thought it. But now, given this unimaginable piece of evidence, God knows it. Abraham trusts. Abraham and God have passed God's test. Abraham had learned to trust God implicitly, and God had proven himself worthy of that trust. The test giver and the test taker have both proven there's reason to celebrate. Now, if your response, like mine, is, Lord, spare us such a test, I think we're right. I think we are right to realize we don't want any part of that scene. Even so, praying, Lord, spare us such a test, acknowledges that God can test as God chooses, that we're allowing God to test. We're allowing God to be God. What I have to get over is this childish idea of mine that all tests are bad. Clearly, I don't think so. I gave them to my students. Clearly, I don't think so. I paid to have professors give them to me. Clearly, I don't think so. I give my children and myself tests all the time. So, if I think that tests are okay in all those situations, why in the world would I think that tests are somehow beneath God? I mean, the very idea that God would know His students, His children, well enough to know what tests we need and how, is a sign that God is intimate, present, transcendent. God didn't just get this thing started and leave us to our own. God continues to come and be among us and try to find the ways that can lead us to greater faithfulness, to greater depth of faith, greater devotion, greater discipleship. Discipleship, that New Testament word, that word of what it means to follow a teacher. Was it not Jesus who turned to his disciple, Peter, and said, as a test, 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Jesus, the one they called teacher, gave tests. Who are we to think we've outgrown them? Look, I don't like the method of Genesis 22 any more than you do. Lord, spare us such a test. I think we rightly pray. And I think we should also add, but Lord, don't spare us all tests. We want a God who cares enough about us to push us toward greater faith and discipleship, toward